October 20th, 2011, the scorching sun shines over the Libyan city of Sirte. Inside one of the drainage pipes hides a man who only hours earlier ruled an entire nation with an iron fist. His hair is dishevelled, his face covered with dust and blood, and his voice barely audible. It is Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator who ruled Libya for more than 40 years. Now he is wounded, surrounded, and fully aware that his end is near. But how did the man who once defied the entire world end up inside this dark sewer pipe? And how did decades of his rule collapse into a chaotic scene that history will never forget? This is the story of the final hours of the brother leader Muammar Gaddafi. Before anything else, how did Gaddafi come to power? In 1969, Libya was a nation overflowing with oil wealth. Over the previous decade, it had transformed from one of the poorest countries into one of the richest in the world. Yet not all Libyans shared in that prosperity. Most of the population lived in extreme poverty, surviving solely by the sweat of their brows. Their ruler at the time, King Idris I, was a staunch ally of the West, corrupt to the core, spending little of the nation's oil revenues on his people. During this period, Gaddafi was a 27-year-old army officer, a young revolutionary determined to change Libya. Even back in high school, he had begun recruiting his friends into what he called his future revolutionary government, a group he later named the Free Officers. From that moment, he and his companions began planning to infiltrate the army, using it as the foundation for their eventual takeover. After more than a decade of preparation, Gaddafi was ready to act. When King Idris left the country for medical treatment in Turkey, the mission, codenamed Operation Jerusalem, was set in motion. Gaddafi made his way to the barracks of Al-Burqa in Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city. There, the generals and officers surrendered to him, without a single drop of blood being spilled, without a single shot fired. It was perhaps one of the most peaceful coups in modern history. Victorious, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Muammar al-Gaddafi arrived at Benghazi radio station, where he addressed the Libyan people for the very first time. From now on, he declared, Libya will be free under the name of the Libyan Arab Republic. Thus, at just 27 years old, the young officer became the most powerful man in Libya. For a time, the quality of life in Libya would indeed rise, surpassing that of countries like Brazil and even the Soviet Union. The new leader built homes and gifted them to the people. He improved healthcare and education. He nationalized the oil industry as leverage against the West. All of this was part of the young colonel's grand plan to become a great Arab leader. Throughout history, there have been many ruthless dictators, but few possessed the same megalomania as Muammar al-Gaddafi. This small man from the Middle East dreamed not just of leading Libya, but of sparking a global revolution. For more than 4 decades, the Libyan ruler would terrify and torment the world with one shocking act after another. The West branded him as evil to the core, a madman. The US government labelled him the most dangerous man in the world. Now let us recount the final days of one of the longest-serving dictators in the Middle East. In February 2011, Gaddafi appeared in his infamous speech, threatening the rebels. This came as a wave of revolutionary uprisings, known as the Arab Spring, swept across the Middle East. Libya was boiling, cities were burning, neighbourhoods had turned into battlefields. For decades, Gaddafi had survived coups and international sanctions, but now he faced a popular uprising unlike any threat he had ever encountered. The revolution began in Benghazi, then spread like wildfire to nearly every Libyan city. With each passing day, his power crumbled further. Defections tore through the ranks of his army. City after city fell into rebel hands. NATO imposed a suffocating blockade on his forces. Gaddafi seemed to live in another era. On television screens, he ranted and threatened. We will cleanse Libya, house by house.
لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر بيت بيت دار دار.
But in reality, his army was collapsing on every front. 8 months after that speech, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, now 69 years old, was running for his life. 2 months earlier, NATO-backed rebels had forced him to flee the capital, Tripoli. He now made his way towards Sirte, his hometown, believing that tribal and clan loyalties there would protect him. But the rebels pressed on, advancing in their pickup trucks armed with light weapons, seizing territory bit by bit. Their ultimate target was, clear, the dictator himself. By mid-October, Sirte, Gaddafi's final stronghold, was completely surrounded. That night he decided to flee with a convoy of dozens of vehicles carrying his closest aides, among them Abu Bakr Yunus Jabba and Abdullah al-Senussi. The plan was to escape Sirte under the cover of darkness and cross the desert southward. But what Gaddafi didn't know was that NATO's eyes were in the sky. American and French reconnaissance aircraft tracked his every move. At dawn, the convoy was clearly spotted, and the strike was inevitable. At 8:30 a.m. the following morning, an American Predator drone fired a missile at the front of the convoy. Moments later, French Mirage jets struck the rear. Cars exploded, bodies were torn apart, everything was engulfed in flames. Miraculously, Gaddafi and a handful of his guards survived, but they were now exposed, wounded, and without protection. Bleeding and covered in dust, Gaddafi fled with the few men remaining, until they found an abandoned drainage pipe by the roadside where they hid in silence. Meanwhile, rebel fighters from Misrata were closing in. It didn't take long for them to spot traces of blood and footprints. They threw a grenade into the pipe, then went in to search. When they saw him, they shouted in disbelief, "It's Gaddafi!" They dragged him out, placed him in the back of a pickup truck amid the rebels' cheers and chants. On the way, they beat him with their fists and rifle butts, an eruption of rage after decades of oppression and fear. Videos of his final moments spread across the internet like wildfire. Gaddafi was bleeding heavily, trying to speak, and then he collapsed. No one knows who fired the fatal shot, but what is certain is that he died before reaching Misrata. The rebels placed his body in a public marketplace, where it was displayed for 3 full days. Hundreds of Libyans lined up to see, with their own eyes, the man who had ruled their country for 40 years with iron and fire, now nothing more than a lifeless corpse, stripped of all power and prestige. Days later, Gaddafi was buried, in a secret location in the desert. Thus ended the story of Muammar Gaddafi, not in a palace, not in golden processions, but inside a drainage pipe, far from the luxury and fear that once surrounded him. An ending that mirrored his rule itself: cruelty, chaos, and blood. And questions still remain. Could he have been tried instead of killed? Would Libya have been different had he lived? What is certain is that October 20th, 2011 will forever be remembered in the history of the region, the day one of the longest-standing authoritarian regimes in the Arab world fell.